Welcome to Mac Stories Unwind, the show that's all about the picks. I'm John Voorhees, and I'm flying solo today, so let's begin. So you might be wondering, where's Federico? Well, this one's not his fault. This is all on me. I had an appointment this morning. I thought it was going to take an hour. It took over 2. So by the time we got to the point of recording, we didn't have time to record Unwind for the week. We only had time to deal with app stories. So I told him I'd do it solo. And so I have a lot of interesting picks for you today. It's going to be a little bit different episode than usual. I actually am going to go with multiple picks, more than just my normal 1 or 2. And I want to start out with something that came out earlier this week, which is Federico's iOS 16 review. Now, you can read it on the website, and it's really fantastic there because it's got all the interactive videos. It's got the incredible animation by Michael Stieber, who also did a lot of the chapter art for various chapters of the review. It's about 27,000 words, though, and that's a pretty long story, a pretty long review. And so one way a lot of people want to read it, and I would suggest reading it both ways, both on the web and this way. But one way that people do like to read it is in an ebook form. And so what we do every year is we publish an ebook based version of Federico's review. We've also done some other ebooks during the course of the year, but it's just for Club Mac Stories members. Now, I'm not going to give you a hard sell on Club Mac Stories. I know a lot of people just bought new iPhones and other gear, and maybe you don't want to spend the money to join Club Mac Stories now if you haven't already. Just keep this in mind because no matter when you join Club Mac Stories, all of our digital downloads are available to you, plus the entire back catalog of newsletters. Now, there are a lot of reasons to join today because, of course, you get our bonus podcasts, you get timely stories in the newsletter, you get all sorts of other perks as well, depending on the tier that you pick. But you don't have to join today. You can join tomorrow or the next day or the week after, whenever you want. But one thing you do get as part of this is an EPUB version of Federico's review. And so it opens in Apple Books, for instance, and it preserves all the videos in there. You don't get Michael Stieber's opening animation, but you do get all of his great artwork for the chapters, along with everything else, all the interactive links and everything. And one of the benefits of reading it that way, not only can you kind of sit back in a comfortable chair and use an iPad or something to read it, but you can highlight passages. You can save those passages for later. Maybe you find something that's something you didn't know about iOS 16, and you want to try it out on your phone later. So you highlight it and you save that link. Or maybe you just really enjoy a particular way Federico puts something and you want to highlight it for that reason. Whatever the reason is, it's just a real nice option to be able to sit down in a comfortable chair and read this like a book and do the highlighting. So if you want to join Club Mac Stories to get the ebook, along with all of our other great perks, just go to plus.club. That will take you to a page that explains all of the tiers. And if you join, you'll be able to go to your downloads page and find Federico's book and download that, along with wallpapers and other things that we have there, along with your other perks. All right, let's get into the other picks. The first thing I thought I would do is talk a little bit about how I find the video games that I play. And I want to do this because I'm not what you would consider, I guess, a gamer's gamer. I'm not like I don't have the time to put into video games as much as I enjoy playing video games that I would like. So I'm by no means an expert. I am very comfortable just saying, you know what? I have limited time. I want to enjoy this story. I'm going to put this game in easy mode for a while and just kind of burn through parts of it because I want to experience the story more than I want to be frustrated with having to backtrack and start over again. And because I have limited time, I think though that if someone is in that position like I am, it can be hard to find games that fit with your personal preferences because it's just not. I read Apple News religiously because it's part of my job. And reading about video games, I suppose, kind of is because of Unwind, but I do far less of it and I have less time for it. So as a result, what I end up doing is concentrating on a few areas to kind of get my news and figure out what I want to play next. So one of those things is I listen to a couple of different podcasts. Now, I know there are a lot of really good video game podcasts out there. And I have recommended before the Video Game History Hour, which is done by the Video Game History Foundation. And that is a really great place if you like older games and the stories behind them. But I also want to mention Into the Aether with Stephen Hilliger and Brendan Bigley, because what I love about this podcast, and I may not always listen to every single episode depending on what the topic happens to be, but what I like is the infectious enthusiasm for the games that are discussed. And that has, over time, drawn me more and more into this podcast, because I started out listening to some of their special episodes where they would go through and rank their favorite games on a particular system and that sort of thing, or maybe a one-off episode where it was clear that they talked primarily about one game that I really like. But I've more and more found myself going back and listening to more episodes because, as I said, it's the infectious enthusiasm for video games that I love so much about it. And it's all, the conversation is always a positive one, even if it's being critical of a game or a particular aspect of the video game industry. And that I really appreciate. And it reminds me a little bit about what Federico and I try to do on Mac Stories, which is it's possible to both be positive and critical at the same time. And I think Into the Aether really does a great job, and I would highly recommend it. The other one I listen to quite a lot, which is on the Maximum Fun Network, is Triple Click. And that's got Maddie Myers, Jason Schreier, and Kirk Hamilton. This show is really well produced. Again, I think what really has drawn me to it more than anything else is the enthusiasm, but also the variety of topics that they handle. Sometimes the show's just about a particular game. Other times it's about a genre, or it kind of is explaining what a particular kind of game is all about. It's the kind of podcast that you can get something from, whether you are just into video games a little bit or a whole lot, because you've got three experts who've all been in the business of covering video games for a very long time, and they have unique perspectives. And I think the three of them really fit together well in terms of both their personal preferences for different types of video games, as well as their opinions about games. So those are the podcasts that I would recommend. I would also recommend a couple of things in terms of writing. First of all, I guess my go-tos are not too surprising. They're kind of some of the bigger names on the web for video game coverage. One is Polygon. I just think that, first of all, I think Polygon just has a bunch of great writers. And to me, more than anything else, I'm drawn to websites by the writers more than necessarily the brand of the website itself. But Polygon, it's part of Vox Media, and it does a great job covering both the news, but also doing in-depth reviews that I think do a good job of walking that line of explaining what a game is like, so you can get an idea of whether it's for you without really spoiling the plot of the game, which is hard to do. I think when you do media criticism, it's very different. It's very different than a lot of the stuff Federico and I write about day in and day out. When we're talking about technology and reviewing it, people want to know what we think of it, but they also want to know what they can do with it. So the whole point is to spoil what you can do with the technology that you're writing about, the app or the hardware or whatever it happens to be. But when you're talking about media, people don't want to know what happens at the end of the game or the end of the movie or whatever it happens to be. And so it's a very different beast in that sense. And I think Polygon really pulls it off. The other site I read a lot is Kotaku. I think this site I have some mixed feelings about, only because they had some real troubles after it got purchased by a private equity group that really, there was a lot of drama at Kotaku and a lot of writers left, which is unfortunate because there were some great people, including some of the people on Triple Click. But the site has survived, and it does still have good writers. So I do appreciate their coverage, and I think that it's rebounded from some of those darker days. So I go there a fair amount. But I think more than anything else, while those two sites might be the staples, that's where I'd say, those are my, CNN and New York Times of video game news and reviews. A lot of times what I do is really I just scroll through Twitter, because one of the things I found with Twitter that's made it more palatable is to separate it a little bit more from my day-to-day work. And by that, I mean, I still follow a lot of developers, apps, and tech journalists and that sort of thing. But I also have sprinkled in a heavy dose of video game industry stuff, whether it's video game developers or companies like Sony and Microsoft and you know, that sort of thing, or the writers, because as I said before, I really am looking more than anything, looking often for good writers. And there are a lot of good writers on other sites other than the ones I've mentioned that write about video games regularly. And I may not go to their sites every single day to see what either they wrote or someone else on the staff wrote, but Twitter's a good way to kind of get those links. And then I'll throw them in an app like maybe Matter to read it later. So that's my top tip for what I read. Now, those podcasts and those websites and Twitter, that's all about discovery. I did want to mention a couple of other things because I know people have asked me this in the past, because one of the things I like playing is older games. And I go through phases with this. I won't pick an old game up for, 2-3 months at a time, but then I do have the Analog Pocket. I've got my 3DS with a lot of downloaded games on it and other ways that I play retro video games. And when it comes to playing actual physical old games, the place that I go to buy them, if I don't already own them, is Luki Games, Luki Games. It's based in the United States, but they do ship to an awful lot of places. Strangely enough, they don't ship to Italy, because Federico and I have had this conversation before, but they do ship to the most of the rest of Europe, as well as Asia, South America, all North America, lots of different places. But they don't typically ship. They don't ship to Italy for some reason, which I think is weird. But it's a great place to pick up Game Boy games, 3DS games, 2DS games. They've got everything. They've got all systems basically going back to the NES and before even. So the prices I've found can be high because physical games, if they're not available in some sort of digital download version today, they can really be expensive, especially there's a whole raft of games in kind of the era of post Game Boy Advance, but before the 3DS, that can be super expensive, like some of the Pokemon games and things like that. But even some of the games from the Game Boy era and other eras can be extremely expensive if they were maybe a sleeper hit and there weren't a lot of copies of them actually created. So Luki Games, though, I think, although you will find buying physical games can get kind of expensive at times, their prices are pretty competitive. And what I like about them is that they guarantee what they ship you. So if it doesn't work for some reason, because, after all, these are older games, they may not work. They do test them. But if they are broken, they'll take them back. Unlike, I think you're really rolling the dice when you buy video games on a place like eBay. And so Luki Games is probably my go-to. So I use that. And they've got like a point system. Eventually you can earn enough points to get some games for free, but it's not the greatest reward system, but it's there. So if you buy a lot, you can take advantage of that as well. Now, I want to close out, I guess, with a couple of apps that we've talked about here and there. I think we've talked about them some on Mac Stories Unwind, but definitely on App Stories, our other podcast. And those apps are Sofa and Game Track. Now, Sofa is a media tracking app that really is about tracking anything, just about. I mean, what you can do with Sofa is you can track video games, but you can also track things like audiobooks and board games, books, movies and TV, music, podcasts, and even apps. So if you want an overall solution, I like this app a lot because it has this concept of the pile, which is kind of a holding pen inbox type of format where you can add things to this app very quickly and then worry later about where you're going to put them. Because what I mean by where you're going to put them is you can create custom lists. You may have a list for a book club you run, or you may have a list for things you want to watch later or play later, or that kind of thing. And you can move them around between lists. The pile is just a nice way to be able to save things quickly that you can get to and see for later, but then you can also at that later date go in and organize them into various categories. The app has a great design. It's very themable. It's got all kinds of themes built into it. And it's really my favorite way for organizing media that's kind of a general purpose app. I want to talk about a more specific app, though, too, which is GameTrack. And GameTrack is a media tracking app dedicated solely to video games. And I think there's a lot of different apps that try to do this kind of thing, but I think GameTrack, to me, does it better than most. It really draws on a lot of great sources for its metadata. So, you search for a game and you get the cover art, which is really nice. You also get a lot of information about what platforms it's on, summaries of the game, websites with information about it, whether it's just Wikipedia or Reddit or some sort of a review, that kind of thing. And then you've got, even now you've got things like user reviews baked into this. And it has its own social component. So if you want, you can post information about the games that you're playing and that you've played for others to see, which I haven't taken advantage of much yet, but I think I may give that a shot over the winter. The other thing you can do is, there'll be video. There are also video trailers and artwork and things in the listings for each game, which I like. Then, of course, a lot like, I guess in a way like Sofa, you can categorize things. I've got a list for things that I'm playing now. I've got a list for things that I've added that I haven't really decided what to do with yet. Sometimes these are games that aren't even out yet. And then, of course, there's an archive for things you're kind of finished with, but you want to keep around because maybe you want to revisit the game later. Maybe you just want to have a list of everything that you've played for some reason. And I've also got an upcoming list, which is just really there for things that haven't been released yet. So there's a bunch of different kinds of lists that you can either create here or that are created by default for you, which I like as well. And you can hook the app up to some of the online services for consoles. So, for instance, you can hook it up to the PlayStation Network or your Steam catalog of games or even your Xbox. So, between those three, that's going to cover a lot of ground for a lot of people. Of course, Nintendo's not on there, but that's just because they don't offer that kind of feature. But it's a great way to very quickly populate GameTrack with a lot of games, then you can kind of organize them however you'd like. So if you're looking for a way to organize those games that you're discovering through the other ways that I mentioned, check that out too. All right, everybody. That's it for this week's episode of Mac Stories Unwind. I'll bring back Federico next week. And as I said, not his fault. I was the one causing the troubles today. It's been quite a year for the two of us. I'm not complaining, and we're making excuses, but we've had more on our plates personally than we usually have with moves and things like that. So we're all that I think we'll be settling it down as the holidays approach, and hopefully we'll be on a more even keel and regular schedule going forward. But thanks for listening. And you know what? If you like the show, I'd really appreciate it if maybe you go and rate it in the podcast app. That would be really cool. Or tell a friend about it. It's another great way for people to discover Unwind, because I think Unwind is a little different than the kind of things we usually do. And I think some people sometimes skip over it and think, I don't know, these guys are all about tech. Why do I want to hear what they talk about movies and TV shows and stuff? Well, you know what? Actually, that's kind of as big of an obsession and hobby for me and Federico as tech is. So it's a nice outlet for us to talk about some of the other things we're obsessed about that don't have to do with Apple every week. All right, that's it for now. I'll talk to you next Friday.